All right, welcome everyone. Get ready to deep dive with us into Abraham Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War. We're basing this on an episode of the American History Hit podcast. They had historian Adam Smith on as a guest, and I was so fascinated by what they discussed. It's just incredible how Lincoln, with almost zero military experience, led the Union through such a challenging time.
Yeah, it's a really compelling story.
Like, how did that even happen? Would he have even been elected if people knew how long and brutal the Civil War would become?
That's a great question. Back then, everyone thought it'd be a quick conflict if they'd known the truth. I really doubt Lincoln would have won.
It makes you wonder how differently things might have played out. And right from the get-go, Lincoln faced so much pressure. His first inaugural address really shows that, don't you think?
Definitely. He was completely focused on preserving the Union, like above everything else. He even said straight up, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. His main goal was simply holding the country together.
So he made his stance on preserving the Union very clear. But he also had strong opinions about secession and the Confederacy, right? What was his take on all that?
Well, Lincoln believed secession was totally illegal. He didn't see the Confederacy as a separate nation at all, more like a group of rebels going against the U.S. government.
So for him, no compromise was possible on a divided nation.
Exactly. And that firm belief really shaped his actions throughout the war.
Looking back, his inaugural address seems almost like a calculated political move. By saying he wanted to avoid war, he kind of put the blame for the conflict on the South.
Oh, for sure. It was a smart strategy. It shaped the whole narrative of the war right from the start. By emphasizing his commitment to peace and the Union, he made the Confederacy look like the aggressors.
It's brilliant, but wasn't Lincoln lacking in military strategy? Do you think that actually helped him in some way?
That's an interesting thought. It's possible that not being stuck in traditional military thinking gave him a fresh perspective.
Like he wasn't limited by old ideas about how wars should be fought?
Precisely. And when you compare him to Jefferson Davis, his opponent, the difference is striking. Davis had tons of military experience, yet the South ended up losing.
So Lincoln had this unconventional approach, but he still needed to build an army, right? And the U.S. didn't have a giant standing army just waiting around.
You're absolutely right. Creating an army from nothing was a huge challenge. Lincoln had to rely on state governors to gather volunteer forces. It was like a call to action for citizens to defend their nation.
So instead of a trained professional military, you had these massive groups of volunteers, mostly with no prior experience.
And think about the logistics of it all. Training, supplying, and organizing such huge numbers of basically civilian soldiers.
Whoa, that sounds overwhelming.
It was an enormous undertaking, and at first everyone thought the conflict would be short, so they weren't prepared for a long war.
And then there's this thing about political generals. I'm not really sure I understand what that means.
So imagine you're Lincoln, and you have to choose generals to lead these volunteer armies. Do you pick the skilled military strategist who maybe isn't the most inspiring? Or the charismatic politician who can rally the troops and keep public support high, even if they're not a tactical expert?
Oh, I see. So political generals were picked for their ability to inspire and motivate, rather than for their military skills. But wasn't that kind of risky? What if they weren't good on the battlefield?
It definitely had its downsides. Sometimes their lack of military knowledge led to big mistakes, but it also served Lincoln's goal of creating a wide coalition.
So it was about more than just winning battles. It was about building unity and keeping morale up.
Exactly. By choosing political generals, Lincoln could appeal to important groups like Irish and German immigrants. He fostered a sense of inclusion and shared purpose in the Union Army.
That's fascinating. So it strengthened the Union from the inside out.
You could put it that way. It shows that wartime leadership isn't only about military strategy, but also about handling internal politics and building consensus.
And speaking of politics, we have to talk about the border states. Keeping them in the Union was crucial for Lincoln, right?
Absolutely. Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. These border slave states were incredibly important strategically and politically. There's a famous quote from Lincoln, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky."
Losing those states would have been a huge blow. Washington, D.C. would have been surrounded by Confederate territory.
The stakes were incredibly high.
And then came the first major battle of the war, Bull Run. And, well, let's just say it was a reality check.
Bull Run was a major turning point in how people saw the war, both the public and Lincoln himself.
It was called the Picnic Battle because people actually brought picnics to watch. They thought the Union would win quickly.
They expected a big show, a quick and decisive end to the rebellion.
But instead they saw a chaotic retreat. That must have been a shock.
It totally shattered the illusion of a quick and easy war.
And it forced Lincoln to face the fact that this conflict was going to be way more difficult than anyone imagined.
Exactly. Bull Run was a tough lesson, but a crucial one for Lincoln, as he started to grasp the complexities of leading a nation at war.
So Bull Run was a big turning point. Lincoln realized this wasn't going to be a quick war. So how did his strategic thinking change after that? Did he suddenly become a military genius?
Well, not exactly overnight, but it's amazing how fast he understood something a lot of his generals missed. Defeating the Confederacy wasn't just about taking land. It was about destroying their armies.
So he cared less about controlling territory and more about stopping the South from being able to fight.
Exactly. He knew that to really win, the South had to be completely unable to wage war. And this focus on targeting the Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee, that became central to Lincoln's strategy.
That makes sense. But it sounds like he disagreed with some of his generals, who probably had more traditional views on war.
There was definitely tension there. Many generals were more cautious, focused on pushing back Confederate lines instead of going after their armies. But Lincoln kept pushing them to be bolder, to attack the enemy and destroy their ability to fight.
And then there's the Emancipation Proclamation. You mentioned earlier that it was more of a military strategy than people realize. Can you explain how that worked?
The Emancipation Proclamation was basically a way to weaken the Confederacy by hitting their economy and society where it hurt, enslaved labor, by declaring slaves in Confederate areas free. Lincoln wanted to disrupt their workforce, their economy, and ultimately their ability to keep fighting the war.
So it wasn't just a symbolic gesture or a moral statement, it had real tactical effects.
Absolutely. While the Emancipation Proclamation was hugely important morally, its immediate goal was to cripple the Confederacy's war machine. It was a calculated move to take away the manpower they depended on.
It's amazing how something so morally significant could also be a military tactic. But the fight for true abolition didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation, right?
Right, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery everywhere. It only applied to Confederate states. And it depended on the Union winning the war. The 13th Amendment was needed to officially abolish slavery across the nation and make sure emancipation would be permanent no matter what happened in the war.
So the 13th Amendment was the final blow, making the Emancipation Proclamation's changes permanent. Now, something I've always found interesting is the Lieber Code. This document set rules for how Union forces should act in a conflict that wasn't even officially recognized as a war between countries.
The Lieber Code was a remarkable document. It came about because they needed guidelines for how the Union Army would fight. It covered things like treatment of prisoners of war, martial law, and limits on cruelty. Basically, it tried to bring some order and humanity to a brutal war.
Wow, so in the middle of this bloody war, they're writing a rule book for how to behave.
Exactly. It was Lincoln's way of trying to make sure that even in battle, some lines wouldn't be crossed, that the fighting wouldn't become completely barbaric.
It's pretty amazing to think about, especially considering how brutal war usually is. Did the Lieber Code have any lasting impact beyond a civil war?
Oh, it was hugely influential. It set a precedent for writing down the laws of war, and its ideas were later included in international agreements, like the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions.
So this document, written during America's own internal conflict, ended up shaping how wars are fought around the world.
It really shows Lincoln's foresight and his understanding that even in war there needs to be ethical conduct.
I also find it fascinating that Lincoln visited the front lines himself. Most presidents wouldn't go near such a dangerous place. Why do you think he did that?
Lincoln's visits to the front lines were really unusual. He wanted to see the war up close, to meet the soldiers, to understand what was really happening. Imagine the pressure he was under. Seeing the human cost of war firsthand must have been sobering, and a way to remind him of the real impact of the conflict.
It seems like something that could have easily gone wrong, but I guess he felt he had to experience the war directly, not just through reports and strategy meetings.
Absolutely. It was a way to escape Washington and connect with everyday people whose lives were being turned upside down by the war. And it probably helped him see how his decisions were playing out on the battlefield.
Now let's talk about Ulysses S. Grant, the general who ultimately led the Union to victory. From what I understand, their relationship wasn't exactly a close friendship. It was more about shared goals, right?
That's right. Lincoln and Grant weren't buddies. They came together because of the war, based on a shared understanding of what it would take to win. Lincoln saw in Grant a commander who shared his determination, his willingness to do whatever it took to defeat the Confederate armies.
So Lincoln saw someone who wouldn't avoid tough choices, someone who wouldn't hesitate to do what was needed to win.
Exactly. Lincoln famously said about Grant, "I can't spare this man, he fights." It shows how much Lincoln trusted Grant's abilities and how much he admired Grant's fighting spirit.
And that trust paid off. Grant led the Union to victory, ending with Lee's surrender at Appomattox. But even in victory, tragedy struck with Lincoln's assassination just days later.
The surrender at Appomattox was important, not just because it ended the war, but also because of the tone of reconciliation Grant set. He offered generous terms to the defeated Confederates, a gesture that reflected Lincoln's own desire for healing and reunification. But Lincoln's assassination, just days later, cast a dark shadow over the hopes for a peaceful Reconstruction.
It's hard to imagine a sadder turn of events. Victory achieved only to have the person who made it happen taken away.
It was a devastating loss for the country, and you can't help but wonder how Reconstruction would have been different under Lincoln.
Would he have achieved the reconciliation he wanted so badly? We'll never know.
It's one of those big what-ifs of history. Lincoln's death left a void no one could really fill. Instead of Lincoln's vision of reconciliation, we got Andrew Johnson's more divisive approach, which really impacted Reconstruction and the nation's healing process.
It makes you think about the impact of leadership, how one person's vision can change a nation's fate. We've covered a lot today. What stands out to you as the most important thing about Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War? For me, it's how Lincoln grew as a leader. He started with no military background, but he learned and adapted. And in the end, he became a brilliant strategist and commander-in-chief.
Yeah, his development throughout the war is really something. He was willing to challenge the usual ways of thinking, to push his generals, and to make bold moves like the Emancipation Proclamation, which turned out to be key to the Union's victory.
And he never forgot about the human cost of the war. His visits to the front lines, talking to soldiers, wrestling with the moral issues of slavery, it all shows a leader deeply affected by the suffering he saw.
It's a good reminder that good leadership isn't just about strategy. It's also about empathy, compassion, and facing tough moral questions. Lincoln had all those qualities.
And don't forget the huge political pressure he was under, keeping the border states in the Union, handling a divided cabinet, dealing with emancipation. It was a constant balancing act.
Definitely. His political skills were just as important as his military leadership. He knew how to build consensus, compromise when needed, and hold together a nation that was almost falling apart.
It's amazing how he managed all that while also running the war. I'm always impressed by how much he achieved in such a short time.
He was truly remarkable, and his legacy still inspires and challenges us today.
Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive, let me ask you this. Do you think Lincoln's personal experiences, like his humble beginnings, his legal background, his struggles with depression, do you think those things shaped his leadership during the war?
That's a really interesting question. It's clear that Lincoln's personal life had a big impact on how he saw the world and how he led. Growing up poor gave him a deep understanding of ordinary people. You see that in how he treated soldiers and his commitment to the Union for everyone.
And his legal background probably helped him think strategically and analytically.
Right. His legal training taught him to break down complex problems, weigh evidence, and build strong arguments. Those skills were super valuable during the war, when he had to make tough choices with limited information.
And then there's the fact that he dealt with depression. It makes his strength and resilience during such a tough time even more amazing.
His struggles with depression add another dimension to his character. It suggests a level of empathy and understanding of suffering. That probably influences leadership.
It reminds us that even the most famous people face personal challenges. So for our listeners who just joined us on this deep dive into Lincoln at war, what should they do next to learn more?
I definitely recommend listening to the full episode of the American History Hit podcast. It goes into a lot more detail about Lincoln's leadership and the Civil War. And if you really want to dig deeper, check out some of Lincoln's writings and speeches. His words are powerful and give you a direct look into his thoughts and beliefs.
And as you keep learning about this topic, think about this. How did Lincoln's understanding of the South, shaped by his own Southern connections, and his belief that deep down, Southerners still supported the Union, how did that affect his choices during the war?
That's a great question to consider. It reminds us that even the smartest leaders have their own biases and ideas. Understanding those perspectives can help us see their actions more clearly.
Well, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time.